Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something absolutely fundamental. Arguably the single biggest pivot in the entire human story.
We're talking about the moment we, as a species, largely stopped wandering and started staying put.
Exactly, the Neolithic Revolution. That massive shift from hunting and gathering, always on the move, to settling down, farming, raising animals, a resource-productive life instead of just extraction.
And it's fascinating because that decision, to plant something and wait for it to grow, it seems simple, but it unleashed, well, everything we think of as civilization.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive isn't just to say agriculture started here, then spread there.
No, we want to get into the mechanics of it, what really changed underneath. The ecology, the economy, the social structures. How did planting a seed fundamentally rewire human systems?
We've got sources covering a huge span here, from deep archaeology in places like the Fertile Crescent, all the way to, say, the complex state organization of the Aztecs.
It's a broad look, trying to connect those early changes to later complexities.
And for you listening, the core idea to grasp is how this lays the groundwork for societal complexity itself. You want to understand states, writing, armies. You have to start with food surplus.
That surplus wasn't just extra food in a pot, it became stored wealth.
And stored wealth needs managing. It needs defending. It leads to hierarchies. It's the absolute bedrock. So let's get into it. Okay, so when we think about the Neolithic Revolution, it's easy to fall into this trap, right? This idea of inevitable progress.
Oh, absolutely. The sort of stages of man idea. You've got your hunter-gatherers, maybe seen as a bit primitive.
Right, then they level up to farmers who are more advanced, and then eventually you get cities and civilization, almost like steps on a ladder.
That's the simplistic civilizational narrative our sources really push back against. What the archaeology actually shows is something much more dynamic.
How so?
Well, our pre-state ancestors were incredibly flexible, really adaptable. They weren't just locked into one mode of survival.
So not rigidly hunter-gatherer or farmer?
Not at all. They often mix strategies. Maybe planting some crops, but still relying heavily on hunting, or moving seasonally between different resource zones. Real inventive hybrids.
That makes sense, adapting to what the local environment offered.
Exactly. And we see this fluidity really clearly in the Fertile Crescent, which is, often called the cradle of agriculture. Groups there were constantly adjusting their strategies.
And this flexibility becomes crucial when things get tough, like with climate change.
Precisely. Let's take the Younger Dryas event.
Yeah.
This was a major curveball from nature.
Remind us what that was again?
It was a sudden, pretty dramatic snap back to colder, drier, almost glacial conditions. Hit around 12,900 years ago, lasted for over 1,000 years.
Wow. Okay, so right when maybe some groups were starting to experiment more with settling.
Exactly. And for those quasi-sedentary groups, especially in places like the Mesopotamian plains who were relying on wild grains and local forage, this cold snap was devastating. Their resources just dwindled.
So what happened? Did they just collapse?
No, they adapted. The evidence suggests many groups didn't just stay put and starve, they reverted. They went back to being more mobile, relying more heavily on hunting and gathering whatever they could find.
So farming wasn't an irreversible trap, at least not initially.
Not at all. It was a tool, a strategy, used when it worked, sometimes put aside when it didn't. It shows incredible resilience, actually.
Yeah.
Agriculture was often a way to hedge against risk, not necessarily a final commitment early on.
Okay, so if they were so adaptable, would eventually pushed or pulled large numbers of people towards permanent settlement, it clearly wasn't just about progress or convenience. Farming is hard work.
It's incredibly hard work, especially initially. No, the shift seems to be driven by a whole cocktail of pressures, not just one thing.
Like what?
Population pressure is almost certainly a big factor. In some prime regions, you might have just reached a point where the hunting and gathering lifestyle couldn't reliably support the number of people anymore. The carrying capacity was hit.
Resources getting stretched thin.
Exactly. And when that happens and people are living closer together, other problems pop up.
Conflict.
Conflict, definitely. Competition over the best land, the best hunting grounds, but also disease. Density makes populations much more vulnerable to epidemics.
Right. Plus, you might be exhausting local game or wild plant resources faster.
All of the above. It creates this pressure cooker. So in some specific, maybe crowded regions, investing heavily in one place, clearing land, planting, tending crops, even though it was backbreaking work, might have started to look like the more reliable, maybe even safer, long-term bet.
It's fascinating, though, that the idea or the technology for a more settled life seems to have been around for a very long time before it became widespread.
Oh, much longer. We see hints of this deep complexity way back in the Epipaleolithic, that period before the main Neolithic boom, maybe 20,000 years ago or so.
What kind of hints?
Well, take the site of Oholo II in Israel's Jordan Valley. It dates back about 19,000 years.
That's thousands of years before we usually date the start of agriculture. What did they find?
Really well-preserved remains of brush huts, quite complex structures for the time, but also, crucially, twisted plant fibers.
Fibers. Why is that significant?
It suggests they were making cordage, ropes, maybe nets for fishing, possibly sophisticated baskets for gathering all those wild grains they were harvesting. It shows advanced material culture and processing skills.
So they already had the know-how to build sturdy shelters, to gather and maybe store resources efficiently.
Exactly. The mental toolkit, the technological capacity for a more settled, complex existence was already there, long before the full-scale shift to agriculture. It's like they were pre-adapted.
The human capability was ready, waiting for the environmental or social pressures to make it the dominant strategy.
That seems to be the case. And it wasn't just happening in the Near East. This is key. The sources emphasize that agriculture, this Neolithic package, seems to pop up independently in multiple places around the globe.
China, Mesoamerica.
Exactly. And South America, too. The region of Peru, for instance, is highlighted as another major cultural wellspring, just as important in its own way as the Fertile Crescent. They developed settled life based on totally different crops, root vegetables, things like that.
Which tells you it wasn't just one group figuring it out and spreading it everywhere.
Right. It suggests a more universal human response to the changing conditions after the last ice age. People everywhere were using their existing knowledge and ingenuity to get more out of their local environments, eventually leading them down the path to domestication and this whole new ecology.
Okay, so let's talk about domestication itself.
Yeah.
When that first seed gets planted, deliberately tended, harvested, it's more than just gardening, isn't it? It fundamentally changes the relationship.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
We tend to think of domestication as humans taking control of a plant or animal, but the sources frame it differently. It's about humans fundamentally altering the selection environment.
What do you mean by selection environment?
Think about life in the wild. An animal has to worry about predators, finding food, competing for mates, surviving harsh weather. A plant has to compete for sunlight, water, nutrients, and figure out how to spread its seeds effectively against all odds. These are intense selective pressures.
Okay, the survival of the fittest scenario.
Right. Now, bring that plant or animal into the human sphere, into a cultivated field or a pen. Suddenly, many of those wild pressures are gone. The grain doesn't need a shattering seed head to disperse itself. In fact, we select against that because we want to harvest it easily. The sheep doesn't need to be hyper-aggressive to fend off rivals. We select for docility.
So we remove the old pressures.
And we impose new ones. Some are deliberate, like choosing the biggest seeds or the woolliest sheep.
But not all of them are conscious choices.
No, and this is crucial. We unintentionally select for things, too. Like plants that tolerate growing closely packed together in a field, animals that can stomach the weird diet we provide them, maybe grain scraps instead of diverse wild forage, animals that mature faster, giving us a quicker return.
Huh. So we're sculpting these species, sometimes without even realizing the full extent of it.
Exactly. We're fundamentally changing their biology, their genetics, generation by generation.
This leads to this idea of the domus complex. Can you unpack that? It sounds important.
It is. Domus is Latin for house, but it means much more here. It's the entire artificial ecosystem created by human settlement. The house, yes, but also the fields, the granaries, the paths, the waste heaps, the corrals, this whole bubble of human-altered environment.
A whole new microecology.
Precisely. And this domus complex had its own power. It triggered what some call the commensal revolution.
Commensals.
Yeah.
Those are the uninvited guests, right?
Exactly. The creatures that moved in to live alongside us, taking advantage of the new resources. Not the animals we intended to domesticate, but the ones who domesticated themselves, in a way, to live with us.
Like mice, sparrows.
Perfect examples. House mice, house sparrows, maybe even some populations of pigs that started hanging around villages. They started foraging in our grain stores, nesting in our shelters, eating our garbage.
And the amazing thing is, just living in this domus environment started to change them physically.
Yes. This is the strongest proof that the environment itself, the domus, was an independent evolutionary force. These commensals started showing some of the same traits as our deliberately domesticated animals.
What kind of traits are we talking about?
It's often called the domestication syndrome. Things like generally smaller brains and reduced skull size compared to their wild relatives.
Wait, smaller brains. Why?
Well, think about it. Life in the domus is, in some ways, simpler and more predictable than the wild. You don't need the same complex navigation skills, maybe, or the same level of constant vigilance. The environment selects for efficiency within that specific niche.
So living near us made them less mentally complex.
In certain measurable ways, yes. We also see changes like smaller teeth, maybe shorter snouts, because the food source, our leftovers are stored green, is often softer and easier to process than tough wild foods.
Okay, that makes sense.
And maybe most significantly, reduced fear response. Less aggression. A mouse that freaks out and bolts every time a human walks by isn't going to thrive in a granary. The ones that tolerate our presence, that are a bit bolder, get more food, reproduce more. The domus selects for tolerance.
Wow, so they become biologically adapted to us just by proximity.
They become codependents on this artificial ecosystem we've created. It shows how profoundly we started reshaping the biological world just by settling down.
And this new managed environment, this domus, it allowed for much greater productivity.
Immensely greater, which fueled population growth. And we see the sophistication that resulted down the line. Take the example of the Neolithic Swiss lake dwellers mentioned in the sources.
Right, these weren't people just figuring things out. They had a complex system already.
Absolutely. The evidence shows they were cultivating multiple varieties of wheat and barley, different types of peas, flax for making linen, even poppies specifically for their oil.
That's specialized knowledge. That's not beginner farming.
Not at all. It implies a long history behind it, a deep understanding of plant genetics, soil, cultivation techniques. These distinct domesticated strains didn't just appear overnight. They were developed over generations, probably by different groups, honing these plants for specific uses. This was advanced stuff.
And the result of all that expertise?
Calories. Vastly more calories per acre than you could ever hope to get reliably from hunting and gathering. And that surplus, that reliable food source, is the absolute engine for everything that follows bigger populations, villages, towns, and all the infrastructure needed to support them.
So once you have that reliable surplus and it's tied to specific places, the fields, the village, the grain stores, the whole economic game changes. You now have fixed assets.
Right. Accumulation becomes possible in a way it wasn't before, at least not on the same scale or permanence. This immediately creates new needs, new structures.
And it played out differently depending on the primary source of wealth, didn't it? Like comparing settled farmers with more mobile herding cultures.
Exactly. For cultures on the steppes or in other areas suited to pastoralism, the domestication of animals like cattle, sheep, goats, that was the revolution. These animals basically turned inedible grass into wealth on the hoof.
Mobile wealth.
Mobile wealth. Wool, felt, milk, meat, hides, bone, everything. And these animals became the very basis of their economy and social structure.
Used like currency.
Absolutely. Herd size determined status. Animals were used for bride price, settling debts, paying fines. They were the literal measure of a man or a family.
But that kind of wealth is risky, isn't it? An entire herd could be wiped out.
Extremely risky. It's inherently a boom and bust economy. A good season, herds grow rapidly. A bad winter, a drought, disease. You could lose everything.
Yeah.
And their theft rating was a constant threat.
So how did they manage that volatility? What kind of infrastructure did that require?
It required sophisticated social infrastructure. Before writing became essential for tracking grain, these cultures developed complex kinship systems, segmentary lineages, basically ways to spread the risk.
Like insurance.
Kind of, yeah. Decentralized insurance through social obligation. If your family's herd was decimated, your wider kin group, your lineage, had obligations to help you rebuild, usually through reciprocal gift-giving or loans of animals. It required flexible, resilient social ties.
Okay, so social complexity was already high there, managing mobile wealth. But then you have the settled agriculturalists, dealing with fixed wealth, mountains of grain in a granary. That's a different problem.
A profoundly different problem.
Yeah.
And the solution, or the tool that evolved to manage that specific problem, was administration, record-keeping, and ultimately writing.
This is where Sumerian cuneiform comes in, driven by bookkeeping.
Undisputedly. The earliest writing we know of emerges directly from the need to manage the agricultural surplus in the farming villages of Mesopotamia around the end of the 4th millennium BC.
How did it start? It wasn't like someone just invented an alphabet overnight.
No, it evolved from accounting tools. For a long time, they used little clay tokens of different shapes. Maybe a small cone meant a small measure of grain, a sphere meant a larger measure, a disc meant a sheep.
Physical objects for counting things.
Right. But it's cumbersome. How do you record a complex transaction? So the next step was to impress these tokens onto a lump of clay, or even seal the tokens inside a clay ball, like an envelope, with marks on the outside showing what was inside.
Okay, getting closer to a record.
Then came the big leap. Realizing you don't need the tokens at all, you can just draw pictures or symbols representing the tokens directly onto a flat clay tablet using a reed stylus. That's the beginning of pictographic writing.
Pictures of sheep or grain stalks.
Initially, yes. You might draw a sheep's head and then make 5 marks next to it for 5 sheep. But the really crucial innovation, the one that unlocks true writing, is abstraction.
How so?
Moving from drawing a picture of a sheep to having an abstract symbol that means sheep. And even more importantly, developing abstract symbols for numbers that were separate from the thing being counted. The symbol for 5 could be used for 5 sheep, 5 jars of oil, 5 days, anything.
That's a huge mental jump.
It's massive. It allows for complex record-keeping, calculation, planning. They started organizing the writing into columns and rows, reading consistently left to right. These are administrative conventions born out of the sheer necessity of managing a large, complex agricultural economy. Bureaucracy literally invented writing.
Amazing. So you've got stored wealth, you've got records of who owns what. The next logical step is defense, right?
Absolutely essential. Accumulated fixed wealth is a magnet for trouble. It needs to be protected. And protecting it requires organization, coordination, and permanent structures, both physical and political.
The sources mention Jeroboam as an example of this connection.
Yes, Jeroboam I, after the Israelite kingdom split. He set up his own kingdom in the north, breaking away from the house of David in Jerusalem.
What did he do that illustrates this?
He immediately fortified key settlements like Shechem and Penuel, building walls, strengthening defenses. This wasn't just about protecting against external enemies. It was also about consolidating his own power internally.
How did walls help with internal power?
By creating clear centers of administration and military control. By making these places physically secure, he was demonstrating his ability to protect his followers and their assets. He also set up new religious centers, trying to break the reliance on Jerusalem. It was a strategy of using fixed infrastructure, defensive walls, administrative centers, new temples to solidify political loyalty, and prevent his fledgling kingdom from collapsing or being pulled back into the orbit of his rivals.
So the defense of stored wealth inherently leads to centralized political and military power structures.
It's almost inevitable. The need to protect the surplus drives the creation of the state apparatus.
And as these settled societies grew, scaling up from villages to towns to eventually empires, that infrastructure of complexity just became more and more elaborate. We start seeing really clear hierarchies, specialized roles, large-scale central planning.
Absolutely. It's all built on that agricultural foundation, enabling larger populations and requiring more sophisticated management. The Aztec Empire is a great example from the Americas, drawing on long-standing Mesoamerican traditions of statecraft.
When they established Tenochtitlan, their capital, how was their government structured to manage everything?
It was highly organized, reflecting the needs of a large, tribute-based empire. They actually had a sort of dual structure at the top, under the supreme ruler, the Tlatoani.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, you had one major official, the Tichkal, sometimes translated as the elder brother. His domain was largely internal affairs for the city itself. Managing land distribution within the communities, overseeing temples and schools, organizing local defense, kind of like the city manager and social services chief rolled into one.
Okay, focused inward. What was the other part?
That was the Tekutli. This official was appointed directly by the king and had a different focus. The Tekutli served as the chief judge, the main military commander for external campaigns, and critically, the chief tax collector for the empire.
So one handles internal community well-being, the other handles external power projection and extracting the surplus.
Precisely. It's a clear division reflecting the core needs of the state. Maintain internal order and social cohesion, and effectively manage military power and the flow of tribute from conquered territories. That tribute, that surplus, is what financed the whole operation.
And the local communities, the Kalpali, where did they fit in?
They were the fundamental building blocks. Each Kalpali wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a social unit, often based on kinship or occupation. They managed their own local affairs to some extent, but they were also obligated to provide soldiers for the army and, crucially, pay tribute goods and labor directly to the ruler and the state.
So the entire system, from the Tlatoani down to the individual farmer in a Cal Poly, is organized around the production, collection, and control of agricultural surplus.
It's a perfect illustration of that feedback loop.
Hmm.
Surplus enables complexity. Complexity requires administration and defense. Administration and defense ensure the continued flow of surplus.
It created these incredibly powerful, complex societies. But there was a hidden cost, wasn't there?
Yeah.
A biological consequence of this settled, dense way of life that had massive repercussions later on.
Yes, this is the concept of deep history and its impact. It's one of the most profound and often tragic consequences of the Neolithic Revolution.
That was the biological cost.
Living in dense, permanent settlements, generation after generation, and living in close proximity to domesticated animals inside the domus complex created the ideal breeding ground for infectious diseases, particularly zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to humans.
Things like measles, smallpox, influenza.
Many of the big ones seem to have originated or become endemic in Eurasian populations precisely because of this long history of agriculture, dense settlement, and animal domestication. Over thousands of years, populations exposed to these diseases gradually developed some level of immunity or resistance. It was a brutal process, but it happened.
They built up a kind of biocultural advantage, as the sources put it.
Exactly. It wasn't genetic superiority in any abstract sense. It was the result of a specific long-term environmental and historical experience, the experience of living in the domus with its crowd diseases.
And the devastating consequence came when these Eurasian populations encountered populations elsewhere, like in the Americas, who hadn't gone through that same long history.
Correct. The populations in the Americas had fewer major domestic animals suitable for generating those kinds of diseases and perhaps different settlement patterns. They hadn't co-evolved with that particular suite of pathogens. So when Europeans arrived, bringing those diseases with them, the impact was catastrophic.
We hear about the population collapse, but the scale is hard to comprehend. What does the detailed research show?
It's truly horrifying. Archival research, like looking at parish records of births and deaths in colonial Peru, paints a grim picture. We're not talking about small declines. We're talking about mortality rates from initial epidemics easily exceeding 50%, sometimes much higher. Smallpox, measles, flu just tore through populations with no prior exposure.
So our culture is decimated.
Essentially, yes. The sources indicate that virtually every indigenous culture in the Americas, whether large empires or smaller groups, suffered massive population loss. Their lack of inherited immunological resistance, a direct consequence of their different, deep history, left them incredibly vulnerable.
So that decision, thousands of years earlier, to settle down, farm, live closely with animals. It inadvertently created the germs part of the equation that dramatically shaped those later global encounters.
It's a direct link. The Neolithic shift didn't just change economies and politics. It fundamentally altered human biology in ways that had world-altering consequences much, much later. It connects the ancient farmer's field to the dynamics of global power shifts thousands of years later. #outro. So pulling it all together, this deep dive really underscores that the Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about finding a better way to get food. It was far more profound. It was a fundamental shift in the selective pressures acting on humanity.
Right. We essentially locked ourselves and the plants and animals we relied on into this tight, codependent relationship, this domus complex.
Exactly. We became biologically reliant on our crops and livestock, and they became genetically reliant on us, shaped by our needs and the artificial environment we created. It was a radical restructuring of life itself.
And the key takeaway for you, listening, has to be how this underpins almost everything that followed. All the complexity of civilization writing, administration, states, armies, organized religion, everything. It all traces back to that moment when human societies could reliably generate and store a surplus.
That surplus was the necessary precondition. It created fixed wealth, which demanded management and defense, driving the evolution of permanent political structures, social hierarchies.
Leading to incredible growth and innovation, but also creating new vulnerabilities, new forms of conflict, and those deep biological legacies we just discussed.
Which brings us to a final thought, something to chew on, related to that commensal effect we talked about earlier.
The mice and sparrows changing just by living near us.
Right. We saw how the domus environment itself, unintentionally, exerted selective pressure on them, leading to things like smaller brains, reduced aggression, tolerance of proximity. So that's the provocative question. If the dome is complex, this new world of settled life, stored surplus, hierarchy, administration, the need to defend fixed property was such a powerful selective environment for other species.
Hmm.
What deep-seated, maybe involuntary selective pressures did it impose on us? On humans, the ultimate domesticates within this system. How did the need to live in larger, denser, more hierarchical, property-based societies begin to shape our biology, our psychology, our social instincts over millennia?
And how might that ancient legacy, that deep programming from the domus, still be influencing our politics, our conflicts over resources, our tendencies toward hierarchy and control even today?
Something to think about.